Hi everyone, my name is Miguel Avila, and like many of you, I'm a fellow longtime Behavioral Observations podcast listener. It is truly an honor for me to introduce episode 200 of the podcast. When I say I'm a longtime listener, let me give you an idea of what I mean. I did some digging and found an email I sent to Matt back in 2016. I wanted to praise him for offering our field this excellent resource and recommended a couple of guests who I'm proud to say have been in high demand, appearing in multiple episodes, namely Drs. Merrill Winston and Patrick McGreevy. Since then, I've been fortunate to meet Matt personally, both in his hometown in New Hampshire and at conferences, often stressing how impactful his podcast has been to so many, from the newly minted to the seasoned BCBAs. Now let me give you just a bit more context for my being here. In October of 2019, I had the privilege of spending a couple of days with Dr. Hanley as he consulted in Nicaragua. A casual conversation about our mutual appreciation for this podcast and the realization that the 100th episode was fast approaching led to the idea of celebrating Matt's milestone by turning the table and interviewing him. As many of you know, Dr. Hanley came through. He did a great job conducting the interview and celebrating the podcast's milestone. Well, 2 years and a pandemic later, we've come to another milestone, this time being session 200. The podcast has duplicated the number of episodes with a wealth of topics, perspectives, and resources, from research to practice, to precision teaching, to ACT, to behavioral economics, to making sense of COVID with topics like mitigating risks, home instruction, telemedicine, and even getting fit in times of confinement, to a Java series that has now 11 episodes, to less commonly discussed topics related to diversity, social justice issues, and racism, just to name a few. So Matt and I found ourselves at a recent conference talking about what could be a cool way to commemorate this journey. Now that we have enjoyed almost 200 episodes, it is time to reflect on the perspectives that have been thought-provoking and inspirational for us. We thought that it would be a cool idea to ask fans to submit their highlights, and Matt has taken on the task to make this collection of passages your next episode. So for this episode, Matt will cue up some special clips that were nominated by audience members. And to that end, huge thanks to all the listeners who submitted their favorite moments from the first 200 shows. Lastly, make sure to stick around till the end because Matt will share one or two of his favorite moments as well. And without further ado, let's join in celebrating episode 200 of the Behavioral Observations podcast.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Miguel, thank you so much for that warm introduction, and more importantly, thank you for your friendship as well as your encouragement to do something fun and different for these milestone-type episodes. You know, I've always maintained that this is a show that's all about the listeners and the guests, so it's with that in mind that I'm thrilled to share the following interview segments that were nominated by so many of you. We did have a ton of entries, so I couldn't put everyone in, but I really am thankful for everyone who did take the time and share their thoughts with me. I did read every single entry. And while I'm expressing gratitude here, I'd be remiss not to mention the support that I've received from podcast sponsors over the years, especially the OG sponsors, Barb Voss at HRIC Recruiting and my friends at Behavior University. I'm also very thankful to all of you who have supported the show through continuing education sales and Patreon memberships. And together, all of those things combined have really helped make the show a long-term proposition and not this thing that kind of comes and goes. So that support has been incredibly appreciated. And together, we've created this medium that's been downloaded almost 3.6 million times in over 100 countries. As I've told many friends and colleagues over the years, back when I was conceptualizing this show, I always knew there would be an audience for this type of content, but I had no idea that it would develop into what it is these days. With that in mind, I'm extraordinarily grateful for all of you who've tuned in over the years. Thanks so much for letting behavioral observations into your commutes, your workouts, your dog walking, your laundry folding, or whatever the circumstances are in which you take in the show. It's been a privilege to be able to share these conversations with you, and I look forward to the next 200 episodes. Having said all that, let's get into today's show. The first clip comes from longtime listener Sarah DeGoya, and she chose a great episode to quote from, Session 87, Straight Talk on Restraint with my good friend Merrill Winston. There are so many quotable quotes in this show. If you haven't caught it already, I encourage you to go back and check it out, or maybe give it another listen if it's been a while since you heard it. In this segment, Merrill is talking about whether a problem behavior is a problem or a crisis. Let's check it out.
Right? So that's why I don't like using the phrase last resort. I like using terminology and definitions so that staff know, hey guys, is this and actually, Matt, we're putting this in the new manual. I have a section called, is it a crisis or is it a problem? And it's like, okay, the kid comes up to the teacher, starts cursing a blue streak at her, telling her that she's this, that, and the other, and ugly and bad things. Is this a crisis or a problem? He doesn't have his fist balled up. He's not threatening harm. He's just saying nasty things. And the answer is it's a problem. A kid drops on the floor when it's time to go to art class. He's in the classroom. He just drops to the floor. He's not doing anything dangerous. This is not a crisis. This is a problem. It's a problem, but it's not a crisis. Now, some people try to solve this problem by using physical procedures. And I'm not saying you should never do that. But I am saying that there are a lot of people that use what looks like a restraint for noncompliance.
Again, this episode's well worth checking out if it's been a while since you listened to it. Sarah also nominated the following clip where Merrill talks about whether or not one should, quote-unquote, give in or strategically capitulate in the context of managing crises.
Regarding de-escalating somebody by giving them what they want, I've done this many times, once or twice with the person. If it becomes an everyday event, now you are building a monster.
All right, that's Merrill Winston. Thank you, Sarah, for submitting those suggestions. And again, the entire episode's well worth checking out. That's Session 87 with Dr. Merrill Winston. The next clip was submitted by Alicia Patterson, and she selected a couple of segments from an interview I did with Pat McGreevy. It was the first one I did. I'm looking at the date in which I recorded it, and that was in July of 2017. So, boy, we're going back a ways a little to check this one out. And since then, I've gotten to know Pat and spend some time with him at conferences and things like that. So it is kind of funny to listen to these interviews that I did way back when. But in this clip, he is talking about his definition for what a functional skill is, and then he goes on to share an anecdote in the way that only Pat McGreevy can share anecdotes. So here you go. Check this one out.
Can you give me what your working definition of functional skills is? So when we talk about this, we can all be on the same page.
Yeah, and it was tough for us to do this because you have the term function as it's used in speech and language, and it has a different meaning there. Mm-hmm. Then you have a common, ordinary, sort of everyday use of the term functional. And then you have function used in behavior analysis in a very specific way, having to do with outcome. So when we sat down to put this into the book, it represented a pretty much of a dilemma. But here's what we came up with. We took some definitions of functional skills that had been in special education for a number of years. And the first one was that it would be required in another setting. So if you're teaching somebody, a functional skill is a skill that would be required somewhere else. Okay? Then it's a skill that would be taught, that is taught in a similar circumstance to that in which it would be required later.
Okay.
See what I mean? It would be so that, I might teach somebody to reach out and squeeze some therapy to build their but that isn't the circumstance that would be required later. What would be required later is reaching out and grasping a spoon or whatever it is. And so you could have a skill, you could have a little component type thing where you're reaching and squeezing the therapy, but that isn't what you'd be required to do later. So we'd make it functional by, at some point, inserting a spoon or something that you would actually have to grasp. And then the third component of a functional skill is a skill that if it's not in your repertoire, someone would have to do that for you. So if you can't wash your hands, someone will have to wash them for you, because you can't go your life without having your hands washed. See what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
If you can't feed yourself, someone else will have to do it for you. If you can't open a door or turn a doorknob, somebody else will have to do that for you. You can't put your shoes on, someone will have to do that for you. And then the fourth component is something, a skill is functional if it provides access to your most preferred items, activities, and people. In other words, your reinforcers. If
Nice.
it gets you, or at least your preferred items, we're not always sure they're reinforcers, but they're certainly preferred items and activities. And if a skill gets you access to those, and to a certain extent helps you avoid or escape from things you find aversive. You see what I mean?
Sure.
So, it would also fall into that. And so that's how we sort of came down on the notion of what constitutes a functional skill. Well, for years, functional skills curricula, or as they were sometimes called, curriculum-based assessments, were quite common in the field of special education. Now, they weren't early when I started in 1968. When I got into that classroom, I saw right away that the materials they gave me didn't look like anything that was worthwhile teaching the children at all. And so I went back to the university where I had been in my master's program, and there was a fellow who had joined the faculty just about the time that I was leaving. And I asked him if he would let me audit his classes, because he was teaching, functional skill type stuff, and I didn't have any background in that at all. And so I realized pretty early through his help that when you sat down in front of some of these kids, I'll give you an example. The laminating machines had first come out in the late 1960s, and I taught one of my first little guys, Vernon. I thought, well, men and women, I got this list of survival vocabulary, see, and I taught him, laminated a few cards, and I taught him men and women, so that when he saw the word men, which would appear on a restroom door, he could say men, and when he saw women, he could say women. See, he couldn't read at all but prior to that, but I thought, well, he'll be able to recognize them, see? But I didn't pay close enough attention to what the actual functional skill was, so I taught him to see the little laminated card, men, and see the little laminated card men and the laminated card women. So he'd see the card men, and he learned to say men, and he'd see the card women, and he learned to say women. But then we went out on a shopping trip, and he looked right up at the sign over the restroom door, said women, and walked right in.
Alicia, thanks so much for suggesting those for this episode. Pat is, of course, a national treasure, and he's got 1,000 of those stories. So if you get a chance to see him at a conference, definitely check it out. He is just a great source of wisdom, and it's been great to get to know him, certainly. Before we get to the next segment, I just want to let you know that this part of the podcast is brought to you by HRIColorado.com. Yes, that's Barb Voss. She knows everything there is to know about recruiting and placement in the ABA field. So if you are a newly minted BCBA, or you're about to be newly minted, you're looking for that first job, if you're moving, or if you just want to know if the grass really is greener on the other side, schedule a confidential call with Barb right away. Go to HRIColorado.com and do that today. You won't be disappointed. This next segment was sent in by Natalie Todd. Natalie, thank you for sending it in. It is from session 181 with Francesca Del Espinoza, another person that I got to see at the Verbal Behavior Conference last April. And in this clip, she describes a very common phenomenon that I think we've all seen, or many practitioners have seen, where learners sometimes develop these very restricted repertoires that aren't particularly flexible and result in these kind of rigid response styles. So I just think the way in which she described it was really nice here. In the podcast itself, which I obviously didn't have time to clip the whole thing, she goes on to talk about the solution to this problem. And again, if you want to hunt that down, you can go to session 181. I'll have a link in the show notes that will take you right there to that particular episode. So I think it's well worth checking out. So here is that clip from Francesca.
But the issue was that we taught kids a lot of vocabulary, a lot of tags, or expressive labels, however you want to call them, and about different concepts. We teach them the names of colors, and we might teach, identity names and people's names and tacting actions and categories and functions and so on and so forth. Yet when I would ask those questions in the presence of an object, so I would show, a well-known object, like the telephone, and I'd say, what color? To a child who knew the names of colors, they would answer telephone. And they, or I might ask, presenting an animal, and they knew the sounds of the animals interverbally. So if you ask, what does a cat say? They'd say meow. Or a cat says, they'd say meow. Or who says meow? Say the cat. But if you presented the cat and then you said, what does it say? They would say cat. And I thought it was a constant problem. So I would see these kids and work with these kids who we were teaching all these different concepts, yet they weren't able to answer the question, the relevant question when it was asked, despite knowing the answers. I'm not sure that makes sense, but that's how a parent described it to me. She was reading a book with her child who in their logbook had the names of colors and as tags, could tag the names of animals and the animal sounds interverbally. And yet when she opened a book about farm animals, and she said, hey, what's this? The child would say, I don't know, cow. And then she'd say, oh, what does it say? And the child would say cow. And what color is it? Cow. And she said, but he knows the colors and he knows the animal sounds. They're all here. I've heard him do it. And I've seen him say those. I said, oh, I guess he doesn't understand the question, even though he knows the answers. And I thought, yes, it's exactly like that. And it somehow you kind of get around it. You run discrimination training procedures. You run different permutations. But I was always struck by the fact that the problem hadn't been conceptualized. There were no procedures available in the literature, but it also didn't feature as a specific skill in any manual. And I thought that was somewhat surprising because it is a consistent issue that we face as practitioners, but it is also a fundamental skill.
Okay, the next clip comes from Rob Harvey, who himself was in session 190, where we talked about the use of role-playing games in the context of social skills instruction. Well, Rob wanted to share some moments from the interview I did with Ashley Rose way back in session 51 that was conducted in May of 2018. So, Rob, thanks so much for going into the archives for something from way back when. There are a couple of interesting and noteworthy clips here regarding the formation of social skills groups, the selection of target phrases, etc., that I think are both humorous and certainly important to think about. And again, if you want to check out the episode in its entirety, you can go to session 51. All right, let's hear from Ashley.
And don't forget your norms too, because teenagers are not the most appropriate population. Preschoolers don't walk up to each other and say, hi, excuse me, my name is Timmy. Can I play trains with you? Yet for some reason, people like to teach that. So it's really, really important to understand what a typical population does. I mean, I made a video about potty jokes, which got an insane amount of views because I was saying, I don't care. I don't care if the 5 or 6 year olds, I prefer the 4s and 5s, making potty jokes to each other and laughing like maniacs because that's shared humor. They're all laughing with each other. Gosh, what a successful interaction.
I know. It's funny. I was talking with someone once and they were like, why are we teaching these kids to talk like 35-year-old women?
Thank you. But so many times I've been in a school setting and I see them practicing social skills in the hallway, and they're walking down and they're greeting each teacher they pass, or they're shaking hands. And I think, gosh, what 9-year-old would shake a teacher's hand in the hallway? Naturally or spontaneously. We're actually making things worse sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I will get a population of kids that come in. I'll say, oh, have they done social skills groups before? Because you see these very sort of rote, unnatural skills. And I think, oh, I'm going to work to sort of undo that a little bit.
And here's where Ashley continues on later on in the show, where she talks about best practices for putting together members of a social skills group.
I do think that this is probably the most challenging piece. I'm fairly comfortable with, and I find our current method to be quite successful. Who knows, a year from now if I may start to change that a little bit. But with that initial screening tool, what we are primarily looking at first, like I mentioned, is those language skills. Level of independence, so is a one-to-one required to participate in activities? Is it all activities or some activities? And I'm looking at that problem behavior. So that helps me start to get an initial idea of, like I mentioned first, whether I think this student is going to be a good candidate for group. Because if the focus is going to be primarily on the reduction of pretty severe problem behavior, I would make that referral to or make the recommendation to continue with the in-home, more intensive one-to-one ABA programming in the home or maybe another center. And then I can give ideas of what the prerequisite skills are to work towards. So that helps me sort of decide who's going to participate. Then we send out that more in-depth tool. So take the triad, for example. And then I start to look through and try to get an idea of what the strengths and areas of need are. I look at all of the applicants that we have. So we run sessions. We'll run a winter, spring, summer, and fall. And we'll get a lot of new kids each session. So some kids will get shuffled around. So I look at everybody's profile, and then I put together, number one, who I think may really like one another. And again, I do, excuse me, make it clear that we're not a friendship group. So if the kids do make friends with one another, that's great. That's fantastic. But they come to me an hour and a half a week. That's really minimal compared to the time they spend in other places, school, whether they go to, they're in a sports or whatever it is. So our goal is to teach the skills within group that they then use to form better friendships with the kids that they see more regularly. But I do want them to have a good time here. I do want them to connect with someone. So I do try to my best to put the kids together with other kids that they may like. Language is so important because if you're working on conversation skills, the kids need to have an appropriate conversational partner, right? That conversational behavior has to access reinforcement. So if I'm trying to talk to someone, they don't talk back to me, my conversational behavior may actually be punished. So we don't want that. We do form groups according to age and need. So I may have multiple groups for 7 to 9-year-olds, but the needs are very different, and that's why they're not together. So I have sort of my groups that are maybe a little bit more impulsive but have very typical language skills. I have my groups that language is emerging and we're really still working on maybe that joint control or joint attention, or we're trying to work on some of that observational learning stuff. So we really work very hard to identify what the specific needs of that group are, because we don't assign the lesson plans or write the curriculum until that group is formed. So I'm not trying to shove any kids into plans that I already have. I'm grouping them first. I'm looking at, okay, this group could really take 12 weeks of instruction on conversation, or this group could really take 12 weeks on go with the flow and reducing rigidity. So that's how they're formed. We are in a fortunate position because we serve a lot of kids. We serve about 70 kids in some capacity. So when you have numbers that high, there's a higher probability that you're going to get kids that go well together. What I see with a lot of places who are maybe just starting out is that you have fewer numbers. So you're trying to form groups with what you have. I would discourage people from forming a group just for the sake of forming a group. If you don't have enough similar peers and you don't have peers who are maybe a little bit stronger and can serve as models in that group, wait until you do, because I don't think there's going to be strong enough benefit that it's a great use of the kids' time. And if they don't make good progress, that's a reflection on the program, and then your program may not grow.
All right. Thanks, Rob, for making that great suggestion. And Ashley, thanks so much for coming on the show to share those words of wisdom. Okay, the next suggested clip comes from Alexa, and she wanted to have a section of my interview with Claire St. Peter from session 193 played. Alexa mentioned that she's a constructionist at heart, and she loves the idea of building on something that already exists. She says, thinking about my clinical work, I appreciate the importance of understanding what kind of foundation exists. So if you're not familiar with what we're talking about here, check that episode out, and Claire will allude to that again in the following segments. So let's hear from Dr. Claire St. Peter.
The second piece is your current usable or relevant repertoire. So the first piece is, where are you going? With an emphasis on building the house and not tearing it down. The second piece, that current usable relevant repertoire, is, where are you now? What skills does the child or the learner, I'll often say child, it's not, Gold Diamond worked with a whole lot of adults, so this isn't anything specific to children. But what is it that the learner can currently do? What history do they have right now that might be a challenge? And how can we change the environment so that history doesn't become a problem? And then the other piece of that is that the current relevant repertoire assumes that the learner is rational. So if I've got a child who's flipping desks over in classrooms, that's a rational response. And I should look at the current behavior and the current environment and say, this teacher or this learner's history has done a great job of shaping this particular behavior. Why? What's there now that's supporting this behavior, and what are the alternatives? So this is why people refer to constructional approaches as being nonlinear approaches.
Okay. Thank you for bringing that up, because I've seen that word thrown around here. So yeah, let's help me out.
I'm going to give you the most elementary version of nonlinear, with the asterisk that this is a giant, monstrous, bigger than a rabbit hole that somebody could fall down.
All right. Duly noted.
So we're going to dip a toe in it and then step right back out. But essentially, when we tend to talk about behavior, we talk about ABC relations. We have antecedent, we have a behavior, and we have a consequence. I bet that many of your listeners, if I prompt them to think about a recent functional behavior assessment that they've done, a recent behavioral assessment of any kind that they've done, it's focused on a behavior, right? Many functional behavior assessments are focused on a challenging behavior, and you identify the antecedents and consequences of that behavior. That approach largely ignores the fact that we are in complex concurrent schedules in our whole lives, and that changing any piece of a complex concurrent schedule is going to change allocation to all of the responses that are available in those schedules. And so in a nonlinear analysis, it's considering not just that single ABC line, but what Golddiamond calls matrices. And so in the matrix, you're looking at what are the available responses and what are all of the outcomes of those responses. And so you're really considering the complexity of the environmental situation in ways that say, like, why isn't the learner allocating responses towards these other alternatives right now? Rather than strictly looking at that one ABC line, you're thinking about how the learner and environment are interacting in ways where the learner is changing the environment is changing the learner's behavior. That behavior then goes on to change the environment. And this is happening with lots of different forms of behavior. So at a minimum, when you do a matrix like that, you end up with 4 cells of things that you're considering, right? Responses that have particular different kinds of outcomes. And then you can tinker with those. This is a really fun activity that I like to do in supervision. So we think about all of the dimensions of reinforcers that we know about, and then you toss in some antecedents and some antecedent context and setting event context. And then you think about, okay, so here's what the learner is doing. And it might be a constructional response. It might be one of those demolition responses. And then we think about all the alternatives that are available to that learner right now. And we start to map out what kind of reinforcer is available for each of these responses. What's the schedule of reinforcement? What's the duration of each reinforcer access period? What's the quality of those reinforcers? Are they static or variable? And then when you actually map those out, more often than not, our clinical team goes, well, no wonder this child is flipping tables. Flipping tables results in an immediate response of 4 individuals who are going to come in, and at least one of them is going to sit down and talk with the individual they're going to get out of work. That's going to happen for at least an hour. They may or may not get attention from their peers. They may or may not get to leave the room. What happens when they complete their worksheet on that day?
Not nearly as rich a reinforcement. Yeah, for sure.
Nothing happens. And so you go like, well, yeah, but I'm not going to tell the crisis team not to come. That would be preposterous. Instead, I'm going to work on what can I do so that the learner has the skills, that there's more reinforcers built in for completing the work. What can I do so that the learner learns to recruit reinforcers? What can I do so that the environment is more responsive to those attempts at recruiting reinforcers? And so it's modifying the repertoire of the learner, and it's modifying the supporting environment to be sensitive to that repertoire so that the deck's not so stacked in a way that the only rational thing for the child to do is to flip desks.
Okay, so this is another suggestion from Rob Harvey. Rob sent me in a bunch of potential clips here. And so this one comes from the Inside Java 7 episode. I believe that's session 155, if I'm not mistaken. And that's when the Inside Java crew and I hosted Dr. Pat Fryman. And there are 2 clips here, and I don't think I'm really going to contextualize them any further than just saying it's from Pat, and they are fantastic. I do want to say before we get to this particular clip, though, that the rest of this episode is brought to you by Behavior University. You know, Behavior University, much like HRI recruiting, these guys have been my longest sponsors supporting the show, and I can't tell you guys how much I appreciate the support. And so if you like what you hear on Behavioral Observations, it would be great if you could visit our sponsors. Whether you pull the trigger on any services or products or not, that's up to you, of course, but at least go check them out and see what they have. Behavior University brings you university quality level professional development. They offer a lot of other products and services too, like RBT and supervisor trainings. And they've got discounts for podcast listeners as well. So go to behavioruniversity.com/observations to learn more. All right, let's hear these segments from that interview with Pat.
It's so easy to blame somebody. There they are. They did it. We saw them do it. What more do we need? I mean, in a court of law, that's all you need. You don't need any more than that. But from our point of view, there's way more to the story that you can't see. It's not in front of you. You don't know the history of that person. You don't know the learning history. You know, I've got behind me is a filing cabinet with a super secret file in it for Charles Manson. And it's a psychiatric evaluation of him when he was 14. And there's another psychiatric evaluation of him when he was 44. So I have those two, and they're fairly complete. When he was 14, his description of him was as an anxious kid. And anxious kids don't have access to some commodities that you and I probably take for granted. And two of those are kind of a sense of certainty in our lives about what's going to happen next, and a sense of control of what's going to happen. And the history of Charles Manson indicated he had neither of those things. He's bounced from foster home to foster home. His mother would come in and out of the picture from time to time, and unpredictably, he was periodically abused, unpredictably. And so his psychiatrist said, this is an anxious boy, and he has virtually no sense of certainty or control in his life. And so he's becoming very controlling and manipulative. And if this isn't worked with, then controlling itself will become a dominant theme in his life. Well, that's exactly the story. I mean, yes, he was a monster at 44, but the primary theme in his life was control, and he never killed anybody. He wasn't even at the murder scene. He manipulated other people to go and do it, which was kind of foreshadowed by the early circumstances of his life. And my point is, if I could have had Charles Manson on my caseload at the age of 14, you wouldn't know his name, because the condition that he was suffering from is a fairly easy one to treat. But if I tried to make a circumstantial argument to justify what Charles Manson did to the people at large in the John Q. public, so to speak, I'd be laughed out of whatever auditorium I was in, because it's just so easy for a human being to get angry enough to be vindictive and punitive. And it's so challenging to go the other way. And then you can't know the circumstances like I do. Like you guys wouldn't know anything about Charles Manson's early history unless I told you. You can't know. You sort of have to assume. And it, like, I did a recent TED talk, and I made an argument about how people could generate a little compassion for problem behavior in the moment by recognizing somebody did something obnoxious. Like, for example, they got on your case for wearing a mask, or they got on your case for not wearing a mask, or they cut you off in line or in conversation or whatever. They did something obnoxious. You have kind of an emotional reaction. You can't avoid that. Those are fast. But if the person would just take a deep breath, let it out more slowly than they took it in, and just ask themselves, what else could be going on here? What could be going on in this person's life that would cause them to act that way, and just generate one plausible set of circumstances that they'd soften a little. Maybe not completely, but they'd soften just a little, and a little compassion would come into the world.
And later on in the episode, Pat continues.
I'm going to give a talk to some entrepreneurial business people in Omaha later on this afternoon. In order to get into this club, you have to be responsible for $100 million in assets. And these men get together monthly, and they invite a speaker to talk to them about something unrelated to business. And one of the themes I'm going to talk about is that I don't assume that there's something wrong with anybody in my office. And yet my profession is to find out what's wrong with someone. And what I want them to see is that there is something wrong with you. That stand is unnecessary for problem solving. And we've all been trained to assume that when somebody misbehaves, that it's due to some kind of a defect. It could be a defect in their character, They're lazy, stubborn, stupid, mean, irresponsible, self-centered, myopic, narrow-minded, avaricious, greedy. You can see I can go on and on here. Or there could be a defect in their morality. They're evil, bad, wrong, awful, unscrupulous, etc. Or their psyche. That's my area. They're got a esis, osis, illogical, something or other. They got a OCD, ADHD, MOUSE, something in a DSM. And that isn't necessary for me to solve the problem. I don't need to indict the person. The problem is something they're doing or not doing, and it's producing a problematic outcome. And that's all that's really necessary on the front end. And then we just have to figure out why are they doing it, or why are they not doing it? And we don't get to use them as an answer to that question. So what do we use instead? Well, we use circumstances instead. They've been shaped to do it that way or not do it that way. And now we're in an area where we can solve the problem. We're not making anybody feel bad. And we think that way in other areas of life. Like, for example, a person that has a slice on their golf swing. Nobody assumes that they have a slice on their golf swing because they have a personality disorder. There's something wrong with their swing. If they go to a golf instructor and they want to find out about their slice, and the golf instructor says, well, the reason you're slicing is because you're a narcissist. I mean, the guy would tell that story to everybody that ever would listen. He'd go home and tell his wife, God, I went to the golf instructor today, and he told me the reason I'm slicing is because I'm a narcissist. She's like, well, you got one thing right. But, the guy would go out of business. Or like when a kid gets a math problem wrong, the teacher doesn't say there's something wrong with him because you got a math problem wrong. He does the reason you got that wrong is because you have an impulse control disorder. No, your calculations were wrong. So in some areas of life, that's how we think. It's what a person's doing or not doing that's causing the problem. We don't indict the person. But when it comes to behavior in general, we just launch right into an attack on the person. It doesn't seem like an attack. It seems like we're really explaining the problem. The reason they're doing this is because of X, Y, or Z is wrong with them. And it's not a very productive way to think about problem behavior, and it really is antithetical to getting along with people. That's why I think people are so resistant to critical feedback. Mm-hmm. They don't think you're criticizing their performance. They think you're criticizing them.
Yeah.
Again, like so many of these clips, I really had trouble finding a nice place to cut things off because I just wanted to listen to the rest of these shows. Anyway, that is session 155, the Inside Java series number 7. The next clip comes from my colleague Jen Ferris, and she suggested this really nice piece of advice for the newly minted BCBA. And this comes from my first interview from session 41. It's with Dr. Russ Harris. Check it out.
I remember thinking that there would come a day where I would have no self-doubt, no fear of failure, where I would know exactly what I was doing. And that day hasn't come, and I now don't think it ever will come. I mean, no matter how much training I do, no matter how many books I write, no matter how many, clients I work with, I can't imagine the day is ever going to come where I don't have self-doubt, fear of failure, the I'm a lousy therapist story has been showing up for me for 25 years. I expect it will still be showing up for me in another 25 years. What I'm able to do now as a result of that is recognize when I've gotten hooked by the I'm a lousy therapist story and kind of unhook from it. There is actually interesting research showing that therapists that are high in self-doubt are better than therapists that are high in self-confidence, provided they are also high in self-compassion. So if they're high in self-doubt and they beat themselves up and give them a hard time, they're ineffective. But if they're high in self-doubt and they're compassionate to themselves, that self-doubt actually keeps them aware and training and learning and open and stops them from the problems that you fall into if you get hooked by high self-confidence and you can lack self-awareness and stop growing and kind of get a bit full of yourself. So I love, there's a quote I love from Sir Winston Churchill. he said, success is the ability to go from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. And that would be my advice. You will fail, you will screw it up, you will make mistakes over and over again. I mean, how many times did you have to fall over before you learn to walk? And all the things that you take for granted today, reading and writing and using a knife and fork and doing up your belt, and those were skills that took so much practice. You made so many mistakes. You had to screw it up so many times. And doing behavior analysis or whatever model you're doing is the same. You will screw it up. You will make mistakes. So learn how to be self-compassionate. Learn how to unhook yourself from, I can't do it, I'm lousy. Learn how to be kind from yourself, and really invest a little bit of time in learning some mindfulness and self-compassion skills for self-care. That would be my advice.
Oh, that was perhaps one of the best pieces of advice given on this podcast. So, Jen, thanks for reminding me. I actually totally forgot about it. And I suppose that's understandable because that was recorded in 2017. So there's probably quite a number of pieces of advice that I should probably go back and listen to over again. So thanks again for reminding both myself and the audience of those wise words from Russ Harris. That, again, was from session 41. The next clip comes from Dr. Greg Hanley, and no retrospective of this podcast would be complete without some reference to his contribution to this show. He has always been generous with his time, and it's been great to see the skills-based treatment and the practical functional assessment process kind of grow up in the number of years that I've been chatting with him about these topics that are really important. It's been great to see the evolution of those particular practices in their research program, as well as the field as a whole, coming to embracing with, discussing, debating these various approaches to assessment and treatment. This particular clip, it was chosen by Celia Heyman, and this is just Greg basically giving a number of us who were on that call a shout out. I think it's a nice thing that he models all the time in terms of placing others before himself, and so he went out of his way to talk about some of the various types of dissemination work, not only just behavioral observations, but the ABA study group and others as well. And I always like that about Greg. He uses the word we more than I, and it's just always been kind of focused on that. And despite his incredible popularity, doesn't really go out and actively try to put the spotlight on himself, and really does his best to highlight the work of others. So for those reasons and more, I want to include this particular clip, and let's check it out. This is from session 160. All right, I think that's going to do it. So, Greg, thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.
Great
Everyone else, we've had like over 300 people on this call.
That's awesome.
All awesome
I have
questions.
To say, Matt, it's cool the way you bring people together. You've been doing it for a while, but you just did it again. And then I get to see all these people that I know, and some of them I know so much I love them at this point. And it's just cool. The community you create. You're a connector. Meg Miller, Celia, you guys are connectors. Dr. J's on this call. You just connectors, and to me that's the cool stuff going on right now. The connections being made, and there's some leaders in this group, so I appreciate that. Thanks,
Celia. Thanks again for sending in that selection for us to play. Again, there's countless, I guess, quotes and things like that we could have excerpted over the many hours of footage that I have of Greg. And even though that one was short, it was to the point. And again, it was a great example of elevating people around you. So again, thank you for nominating that as a selection. And Greg, if you're listening to this, thank you for spending so much time chatting with me on the podcast. Okay, for the rest of the show, we're going to concentrate on this one particular episode that I did that was pretty noteworthy. When people ask me what my favorite episode is, and I get asked that question actually quite a bit when I meet people at conferences. My answer changes from time to time. And the fact of the matter is, most of the episodes are my favorite episodes because I really love doing this job, if you will. I really do. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it. But some episodes are I don't know, hit close to home, or some episodes can take on a meaning that I didn't see initially and only can see upon some reflection. And so this episode certainly qualifies as that. Way back in session 63, I had an opportunity to interview a guy named Dr. Chuck Merbitz. If you're not familiar with Chuck, he's huge in the precision teaching community. And at the time he agreed to chat with me, he was battling terminal brain cancer. I think it was brain cancer. And right out of the gate, I was grateful for that opportunity. Here's a guy who quite literally had limited time. We all have limited time, of course, but his was more finite than the rest of us. And he took time out of his day, time that he could have been interacting with his family members and things like that, to chat with me, to share really great stories. And I just couldn't be more grateful that he was able to do that. And I'm also grateful for the opportunity to share his voice with the audience. And also, it could be something that his family could listen to later on and have, So anyway, one of the things that I do regret, I'm not a big regrets person, but one of the things I do regret is not having a round 2 with Chuck. It is something that we talked about, and unfortunately, we just ran out of time, quite literally, and I am bummed we did not have a chance for another chat because I really did enjoy speaking with him so much. And that conversation was the only, aside from email to kind of set up the interview, that was the only conversation that I did have with him. But I know a ton of people who knew him very, very well, and to a person, they attested what a great guy he was, and that certainly matched my impressions of Chuck. So what we're going to do here is we're going to listen to a couple segments from Chuck's episode. And I know I've said this a bunch of times already throughout this podcast because I think all these episodes are fun and in their own way. And this one's really, really good. It's really important, especially the second half of it. So again, do yourself a favor, check it out. Give it a re-listen if you've listened to it the first time around. It's been a few years since it's been published. And I think you'll get something else out of it. When I gave it a re-listen, there were a number of things that dawned on me that I didn't catch the first go around. So let's listen to Chuck. Dr. Chuck Merbitz, thank you so much for joining me today on the Behavioral Observations podcast. How are you doing?
I am great today.
Okay, this is Today Me. I just want to break in real quick, and I might break in with some commentary here and there. But again, listen to the enthusiasm in his voice. I am great today. Again, this did not strike me until I re-listened to the show just the other day. All right, let's continue. This is Chuck talking about working with other disciplines within psychology.
You really shouldn't lock yourself into, I'm not going to listen to those people because, they're idiots. It's not like I have time to hear every nutty theory in psychology, or anybody does. And it's not like I'm not convinced. I mean, I think Skinner's vision is the one that will eventually win, but it will take a long time for a number of reasons, which we can talk about. But still, it's profited me immensely over my career to be able to listen to people who come from other theoretical worlds, even other worlds within psychology, and not just dismiss them out of hand or be mean to them or, do personally nasty things to them, which I can tell you sometimes my colleagues from counseling and other branches of psychology do to behavior analysts, but I've seen behavior analysts do that to them too. So it's not like, not like there's no sins here.
Chuck had 1,000 stories, and here's a fun one that he shared on the podcast where he talked about his experiences in I want to say it's the early to mid 70s, helping veterans with alcohol use disorders get jobs. And it was a very similar strategy that he and his colleagues used to help these guys actually get dates. So check this out.
So here we had this ward full of alcoholic World War II vets, or post-alcoholic in in the early 70s in a college town. So this town has something like, 20,000, 28,000 undergraduates who are all basically looking for part-time jobs. And then you got these guys, and then you got the townies. Well, Mark came up with a way of using precision teaching to help these guys get jobs and find romantic liaisons. And I'll take just a minute to describe the system that he used, because it was so brilliant. So, I mean, seriously.
I think the latter part is probably piquing most people's interest right now. So, yeah, go ahead.
It's the same. It's all based on frequency and selectionism and something that we didn't understand at the time, fluency. We didn't know that, but Mark was using it. So let's say that, you want a job and, you're sitting around the ward. Great. So you join Mark's job seeking club. So every Friday you go to the job seeking club data sharing meeting where everybody puts up their chart on an overhead projector and talks about what they did the previous week. And there's a couple of staffers present to make sure that it's all positive and laudatory, and that the more experienced guys can tell the guys who are less experienced in the system, different things. Oh, yeah, when I was at stage 2, here's what I did, stuff. So the steps are something like this. First, you count job thoughts. Okay, this is a pretty low barrier, but you want to get up to about 10 job thoughts a day. So you have a chart of your job thoughts, and if a guy comes up and posts a chart and he's stuck at 4 or something like that, that's okay. Because the other guys will talk to him about, well, how do you get more job thoughts and stuff? And the social reinforcement will take over, and it'll accelerate his job thoughts.
And these guys are charting their stuff on a standard acceleration chart?
Oh, yeah, that's very easy. In fact, I can tell you that Henry used to say that the difficulty of teaching people to chart is directly related to the number of years of formal education. And it goes to an asymptote with PhD.
There are so many moments like that in this particular podcast episode. Here's another one. It's a bit of a longer cut, doesn't really need much commentary. So check this one out.
One thing that I find very distressing is an arrogant behavior analyst. And you send them to a good, experienced counseling person, and they'll start telling you stories about the middle-aged women in their practice who were systematically raped as children for years and decades, and their families basically told them to, shut up and take it. And they lead terribly destructive, self-destructive, painful, awful lives as the result of this. Now, it's not that the behavior analytic tools to talk about behavior change aren't useful. It's that the incredible human pain that people bring to the situations are often lost on students who aren't exposed even to stories about things like that. And it doesn't prepare them to approach every client with some humility, because you don't know their backstory. If you're lucky, they'll tell you their backstory, and it'll help you to work more effectively with them. But there's a lot of wonderful people in this world, and there's a lot of people who have been treated really, really badly, and whose lives have been shattered. And you can see them going out and doing self-destructive things with the drugs. You can see them letting guys live in their trailer who are off stealing hubcaps and all this other stuff. And it's like, well, why don't you just kick them out? Because, well, it's a whole universe that we have to grapple with. And it's a much more of a pragmatic and human relationship grappling than it is a kind of cut and dried count this kind of grappling. By the time you get a client to the place where you can have them count things, 90% of the work is done. And we usually don't think about that in behavior analysis because we focus on the stuff that we can measure, but there's a whole hell of a universe out there that we don't have really good measurement tools for. I'm not saying that they do. I don't think they do either, but that's another story. But those things happen to people. Those are valid experiences. Those are things that shape the way people live and hurt and talk and experience. And we, as behavior analysts, have to be able to grapple with that. Now, I don't really do that. I mean, I know a little bit about FAP and ACT and relational frame theory and stuff like that, and I think that's awesome. I mean, you go for it, guys. Especially you can read like the FAP books, and it's very clear that they're onto something. But we're a very young science, and we have got so much to learn, and there's only so many minutes in your lifetime, and you got to pick what you're going to learn. But you still shouldn't restrict your thoughts and energies to the stuff that's easy to measure, and especially because you're afraid of the stuff that's not.
That episode was so good, and like some of the others I talked about already, I had a hard time trying to find an appropriate place to cut it off for the purposes of this show. So, the word humility is used a lot these days. If you look at any conference that's scheduled, many talks have something to do with humility this, humility that. Chuck seemed, but as far as I can tell, Chuck seemed to live it and exemplified that way before it became a common theme in behavior analytics circles. So again, it was really quite an honor to be able to have him on the show to share his message, thoughts, etc. With the audience, and more broadly preserve it for others to enjoy down the road. And I believe that brings us to the end of this special episode of Behavioral Observations. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. It really was a lot of fun to put together. Huge thanks to Miguel for just the encouragement and the wonderful introduction. Also, I very much appreciate everyone who took the time, not only just to suggest episodes, but to timestamp them and do all the the kind of tedious work that goes along with contributing to this. It's they really did put in a lot of effort. I really appreciate that, and I apologize that I couldn't get to everyone's suggestion. Otherwise, this podcast would have gone on for hours. So, having said that, if there are segments that you wished we would have covered and didn't, let me know. Maybe we can do another one of these at session 250 or 300 or some other round number. So, as I mentioned earlier, this podcast has just meant so much to me, and I really appreciate everyone who takes time out of their day to listen to it. I really just can't thank you enough. So, I guess the only thing left to say is I guess I'll see you in session 201. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.